In a sleepy town where secrets rarely stayed buried for long, a chilling confession from a 6-year-old boy shattered the quiet like thunder. "My mother isn't gone. She's under the floor," he whispered, words that turned suspicion into a race against time and an innocent child into the bravest witness the city had ever known. This is the story of Elijah, a boy whose soft voice cracked open a web of lies that stretched from the kitchen floor to the courtroom itself. It's a story of betrayal and greed, of power and privilege wielded like a weapon, and of a mother's love that refused to be silenced, even in death. But more than that, it's the story of a community's awakening, a testament that sometimes the smallest voice can hold the greatest truth, and that no matter how deep you try to bury it, the truth always claws its way back into the light. So join us as we uncover every layer of this gripping tale of courage and justice. A story that proves even in the darkest corners, hope can still find a way to rise. Rain drummed steadily against the tall glass windows of the police station, each droplet dripping like a silent tick of a clock. Inside, the fluorescent lights cast a pale, almost ghostly glow over the tiled floor. At exactly 7:42 a.m., a small figure appeared at the entrance. A slim 6-year-old boy with tightly curled hair, wearing a threadbare raincoat that had once been bright yellow, but now looked soot-streaked and forlorn. Clutched in his tiny hand was a battered toy truck, its paint chipped, wheels sticky, evidence of both play and long neglect. The boy walked past the reception desk and into the main interrogation room, where Lieutenant Sandra Brown sat sipping lukewarm coffee. Across the room, Officer Martinez leafed through a stack of old case files. Neither man was prepared for the boy's simple but horrifying statement. "He isn't gone," the boy said, his voice soft yet unwavering. "He's under the floor." Time seemed to stop. Martinez paused mid-page, raising an eyebrow over thin-rimmed glasses. Maybe it was a trick of the light, or maybe it was just the exhausted imagination of a child waking after a thunderstorm. But that moment froze everything. Sandra set her coffee down and leaned forward, fixing her gaze on the boy. "What's your name, son?" "Elijah," he replied without hesitation. Then, after a barely perceptible pause, "Elijah Taylor." Her pen hovered over her notebook. Elijah Taylor. That name stirred something deep in her memory. He glanced at his grip on the toy truck. "He's under the floor," Elijah repeated. "The floor I helped my mom fix." And then, in a voice so quiet it felt as though he were confessing a terrible secret, she said it was our secret. Martinez closed the file in his lap and cleared his throat. "There's that imagination again," he muttered. "Most kids rhyme off ghosts and monsters, not burials." But Sandra saw something that Martinez couldn't dismiss. She saw Elijah's eyes, bright, fathomless pools of brown that didn't dart shyly or wander nervously. They were unblinking, unflinching, and strangely insulated from fear or confusion. It was the stare of a child who had seen something no child should ever witness. She looked across at Elijah and caught the moment he risked a glance back at her, a flicker of something in his eyes, a spark of trust, of appeal. It's okay," she said softly. "Can you tell me where this is?" Elijah shifted and then said in an even softer voice, "In our kitchen. Under the tiles Mama laid down." The fabric of his raincoat rustled gently as he leaned in. Martinez raised an eyebrow. "Pizza tiles?" "No, big squares, gray ones with white stripes, like a chessboard." Elijah repeated his words slowly, as though reciting facts he had practiced 1,000 times. Sandra swallowed. She signaled the door quietly. Martinez frowned. "What if it's just a story?" "It doesn't feel like one," Sandra whispered. Then she gently addressed Elijah again. "Tell me about your mom." Elijah's lower lip quivered ever so slightly. "Mama is a teacher. She helps kids learn to read and write." He sounded at once proud and mournful. "And do you know where she is now?" Elijah's small head tilted to one side. "Mommy's quiet. She didn't come home 3 nights ago. I was scared." He paused, gripping the toy truck so tightly that the painted letters nearly flaked off. "I told Daddy. Daddy said she went away to think. But last night, Mama was crying, it was loud, and then nothing." Sandra closed her notebook and stood. "All right, Martinez, let's think this through." Martinez leaned forward, folding his hands on the table. "Either this is a child's vivid imagination," he said, "or we've got something worse than possible. You know as well as I do, this station hears missing persons all the time, and no one finds them living under a floor. Martinez's voice trembled slightly. Part frustration, his part fear. Sandra nodded grimly. True, but missing mothers don't usually come with storybook tile descriptions either. There was a silence before Martinez spoke again. Have we got any record of a Taylor family living nearby? Sandra tapped her pen. There's one on Elm Street. Single father, works evenings, kid about this age. Mom's a teacher at Greenwood Elementary. Martinez frowned. Every now and then, parents drift off, divorce, or life gets messy. Sandra shook her head. That's not what this sounds like. The boy isn't saying she left. He's describing a burial. She drew a shaky breath. And he's offering details. Floor tiles with stripes, the kitchen, mommy crying, daddy's explanation. These aren't fairy tales. She paused and met Elijah's eyes. Elijah, I'm going to call your neighbor, okay? Mrs. Rosa? She brought you here, right? Elijah nodded. The minute he turned away, Sandra scribbled, Taylor, Elm Street, kitchen tiles plus stripes, possible abduction or homicide involving the floor. Martinez opened his mouth to argue, but stopped as Sandra stood. Find out who owns the place. What renovations have been done in the last week? Police any surveillance? Itching for a warrant. She paused at the door with that same sense of wounded gravity. And get someone to ask Rosa to come by, quietly. As she guided Elijah out of the room to join the neighbor, Sandra cast a long glance back at the empty chair. On the tabletop sat Elijah's tiny toy truck, wheels frozen in place, as if it too were holding its breath. In that moment, with the rain drumming a mournful dirge against the glass, Sandra realized the truth. The station wasn't just processing a child's fear. It was wrestling with something far darker. And Elijah Taylor had just pulled a single thread, one that could unravel an entire house of secrets hidden beneath cold, unmarked tiles. As the rain continued to tap against the window, like the persistent ticking of an old clock, Sandra walked beside Elijah through the hallway of the police station, the fluorescent lights flickering above them, making everything feel surreal, like a half-forgotten dream. She watched the way Elijah's small hand clutched at the sleeve of her jacket, his toy truck now dangling from his other hand, its once bright red paint dulled by years of play. Mrs. Rosa was waiting in the reception area, her eyes wide with a mix of worry and quiet resolve, her umbrella dripping rainwater onto the linoleum floor, forming small pools around her feet. When she saw Elijah, she opened her arms, and the boy hesitated for only a moment before leaning into her embrace, the weight of what he had seen pressing down on his small shoulders. He's been saying these things all morning, Mrs. Rosa whispered to Sandra, her voice low, her eyes darting around as if afraid someone else might be listening. I've known Aisha since she was a little girl. She'd never just leave that boy, never. And Elijah, he doesn't lie. He's not like other kids. He's always been quiet, always watching. Sandra nodded, her mind racing, the pieces of the puzzle clicking together one by one like a lock turning. She knelt beside Elijah, brushing a stray curl away from his forehead. Elijah, I want you to tell me everything you remember about the night your mommy didn't come back. Start at the beginning, okay? Elijah took a breath, his small chest rising and falling as if gathering courage. It was late, he began, his voice a whisper but steady, and I was in bed, but I heard mommy crying. Daddy was yelling at her, saying she was being selfish. Then I heard a loud sound, like when you drop a pot on the floor. I wanted to go see, but the door was locked. He looked up at Sandra with eyes that seemed older than any child should have. I heard them talking after that. Mommy wasn't talking back anymore. Daddy was dragging something heavy. Mrs. Rosa covered her mouth with a trembling hand, tears welling in her eyes. Sandra forced herself to stay calm, to keep her voice even. And then what, Elijah? He swallowed hard. Then it was quiet. I fell asleep, and when I woke up, the kitchen floor looked different. Daddy told me he was fixing it, but I saw the men come with the tiles. They had big bags, and they worked until the morning. Sandra exchanged a glance with Martinez, who had come to stand just behind her, his face pale. Big bags, Martinez repeated. Elijah nodded. Like the kind you take to the beach, heavy. Sandra's skin prickled with cold. She could almost see it in her mind's eye, the pale kitchen light flickering as strange men moved across the floor, the sound of shovels scraping, the smell of fresh cement, and the lies thick in the air. Elijah, do you remember what Mommy said to you last? She asked gently. The boy's mouth trembled. She said, be brave, Eli. This isn't your fault. and she kissed me goodnight, but she was crying. Sandra closed her eyes, willing herself to stay composed. She felt the weight of every word, every pause, every tear in Elijah's voice. This wasn't just a child's fantasy. This was the raw, unfiltered truth of a soul too young to carry it alone. "We need to see that house," Martinez murmured, his voice taut. Sandra nodded. "But the judge will never sign off on a warrant based on the testimony of a 6-year-old, even one as clear-eyed as Elijah." Mrs. Rosa squared her thin shoulders, surprising them both with the steel in her voice. "Then you do what you have to do, Lieutenant, but you find her. You find Aisha. That boy deserves to know the truth." Outside, the rain was easing into a mist, the world going quiet in that strange, heavy way it sometimes does when something momentous is about to break. Sandra looked at the boy, her heart aching for the innocence he'd been forced to surrender. She rose, turning to Martinez. "We'll start with the renovation permits. Any company that did work on that kitchen, find them, and find out who paid them." Martinez nodded, already pulling out his phone, his fingers flying across the screen. Sandra took Elijah's hand again, feeling the slight tremor in his small fingers. "You're very brave, Elijah," she said softly. "What you're telling us is very important, and I promise you, we're going to find out what happened to your mommy." He looked at her with those ancient eyes and simply nodded. There was no relief in his face, no joy, just a solemn acceptance, as if he already understood that the truth doesn't always bring comfort, only clarity. Sandra rose, feeling the weight of the badge on her chest as both a responsibility and a burden. She looked back once more at the boy, at Mrs. Rosa's worried face, at the reflection of rain-soaked windows and the quiet hum of the station around them. She knew this was only the beginning. There was a story under those tiles, a story Elijah had cracked open with his quiet words, and it was up to her to finish it. In that moment, she made a silent promise to herself and to the small boy who had trusted her with the most painful secret of his young life. No matter how many doors slammed shut in her face, no matter how many walls of privilege and money she had to break through, she would not let this story be buried. The truth was already clawing its way up from beneath the floor, and she would not look away. That night, Sandra couldn't sleep. The rain had stopped, but the sound of Elijah's quiet voice still echoed in her mind, every word a chisel tapping away at her resolve. She lay in bed staring at the dark ceiling, feeling the cold weight of the badge on the nightstand, the unspoken vow that had become her burden to carry. She replayed every detail he'd given her, the new tiles, the strange men, the sobs that fell silent. There was no room for doubt now. She had to act before the truth was buried for good. Before dawn, she was back at the station, her coffee bitter and scalding in her hand, the air heavy with the smell of damp earth that seemed to have followed her inside. Martinez was already there, eyes red-rimmed, but determined, fingers drumming nervously on the countertop as he pulled up building permits on the computer. "I got something," he said, voice hoarse. "There's a record of a rush job, kitchen renovation at the Taylor residence 2 days ago. Contractor named Jarvis Construction. They were paid in cash." Sandra leaned over his shoulder, scanning the lines of the report. The details were there, black and white, but what lay beneath was a much darker truth. "Find out who signed the work order," she said, her voice low but steady. Martinez gave a tight nod, already dialing numbers, his tone clipped and professional. As he worked, Sandra walked down the hallway to the interview room where Mrs. Rosa and Elijah were resting. The boy was curled up on the bench, clutching his toy truck like a lifeline, and Mrs. Rosa was humming softly, a lullaby to soothe a child who hadn't known sleep in days. Sandra paused in the doorway, watching them, feeling the weight of generations in the lines of Mrs. Rosa's face, the quiet strength that had carried her through more storms than Sandra could imagine. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft. "Mrs. Rosa, I need you to take Elijah home with you tonight. Keep him safe." The older woman looked up, her eyes full of both worry and steel. "I won't let anything happen to him, Lieutenant. He's all I have left of her." Sandra nodded, feeling a twinge of sadness at the truth in those words. Elijah stirred then, his small face turning toward her, and she saw the flicker of a question in his eyes. "Are you going to find her?" he asked, his voice no louder than the whisper of the wind outside. Sandra knelt beside him, her hand brushing his curls. "I promise, Elijah. I will find her, no matter how deep she's hidden." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of an unbreakable vow. When she rose, she left them in the warm light of the interview room and stepped back into the dim hallway. Martinez met her there, phone still pressed to his ear, his expression grave. The contractor says he was paid cash by Nathan Taylor himself. No questions asked, no permits pulled for the plumbing or electric, just a kitchen floor that needed to be done overnight. Sandra felt her stomach tighten. He didn't think that was suspicious? He said he did, but the money was good and Nathan seemed persuasive. Martinez hesitated, then added, he said Nathan told him not to ask questions, that the job was personal. Sandra exhaled, the air sharp in her lungs. We're running out of time, she said quietly. If Nathan realizes we're digging deeper, he'll vanish. Or worse, Martinez murmured, the implication hanging heavy in the space between them. Sandra's mind was already moving ahead. We need a search warrant. I don't care if the judge thinks this is just a child's imagination. We have enough to make them listen. She turned on her heel, her steps quick and sure, but Martinez caught her arm. Sandra, think for a second. If we push too hard, he'll lawyer up. He's got money. He's got connections. If we lose this, Sandra pulled her arm free, her eyes cold. If we lose this, a murderer walks free. I'm not letting that happen. She left him standing there, already dialing Judge Morrison's number. The line rang twice before the judge answered, his voice thick with sleep. Morrison, he grunted. Your Honor, it's Lieutenant Brown. I have a probable homicide at the Taylor residence. She launched into it, every detail from Elijah's words to the contractor's statement, weaving the pieces into a tapestry of quiet horror. She could hear the doubt in Morrison's voice, the hesitance born of years spent balancing truth against privilege. Sandra, you're asking me to authorize digging up a family's home based on the testimony of a 6-year-old and a contractor who doesn't want to lose his license. I'm asking you to do the right thing, she shot back, her voice low and fierce. That boy saw what he saw, and if I'm wrong, I'll take the heat. But if I'm right, she let the rest hang in the air, the weight of it speaking louder than her words. There was a long pause on the line, the kind that stretched and twisted like the silence between heartbeats. Then, I'll sign it, but be careful, Lieutenant. You're about to tear open a wound that might never heal. The line went dead, but the promise crackled in the air like static. Martinez looked up as she slipped her phone back into her pocket. We've got the warrant. She nodded. We move at first light. Outside, the first faint light of dawn was breaking over the city, the rain-washed streets glistening like secrets finally laid bare. Sandra looked out at the horizon, her reflection a dark silhouette in the glass. In the stillness, she could almost hear Aisha's voice, whispering through the cold tiles, through the walls that had kept her prisoner in her own home. Be brave, Eli, she heard the echo of a mother's final plea, and Sandra, heart pounding and hands steady, made another silent promise. I will be brave for you, I will find you, and I will not let the truth be buried. At dawn, the police convoy rolled down Elm Street, headlights slicing through the early morning fog. The neighborhood was still, the pastel houses standing like silent witnesses to the darkness that had taken root in one of their own. Sandra stepped out first, her breath fogging in the crisp air, the search warrant clutched in her hand like a shield. Martinez followed close behind, his face set in grim determination, while 2 uniformed officers quietly sealed off the perimeter of the Taylor home. The house itself looked deceptively peaceful. White siding, green shutters, the porch swing swaying gently in the breeze, as if nothing at all had gone wrong. But Sandra knew better. She could feel it, like a weight pressing down on her chest. They were not here for routine. They were here to lay bare what had been hidden, to crack open the polished facade of a life that had seemed so perfect from the outside. Nathan Taylor was already waiting on the porch, a tight smile on his face, a cup of coffee in his hand, as if he were hosting guests rather than about to be unmasked. Lieutenant, he said smoothly, what an early surprise. I hope this isn't about those silly stories my son's been telling. He's got such an active imagination. Sandra held his gaze, refusing to be pulled into his performance. Mr. Taylor, we have a warrant. We're going to need you to step aside. For a brief moment, something flickered in his eyes. Annoyance, maybe even fear, before his expression settled back into that practiced calm. Of course, he said, stepping back and holding the door open. By all means. The house smelled of coffee and lemon cleaner, the air almost too clean, as if someone had been scrubbing away not just dirt, but memory itself. Elijah's drawing flashed in Sandra's mind. The checkered floor, the heavy bags, the silence that followed the cries. She led the team into the kitchen, the others fanning out through the rest of the house. The kitchen was exactly as Elijah had described it. Sleek new tiles, the grout lines still bright white, almost too perfect. Sandra knelt down, running her gloved fingers along the seams, feeling the cold smoothness beneath her touch. "Here," she said quietly. "This is where it starts." Martinez nodded, signaling the forensics team to bring in the scanners and ground-penetrating radar. They moved with careful precision, the whir of the equipment the only sound in the room. Nathan stood leaning against the doorway, arms folded, watching with a detached curiosity that made Sandra's skin crawl. "You know," he said conversationally, "I've always admired the way law enforcement can turn the smallest thing into a whole story. It's quite creative." Sandra didn't look up. "This isn't a story, Mr. Taylor. It's your life, and hers." The scanner beeped softly as it moved over the floor, the small green light flashing in steady rhythm. Then, abruptly, it shifted, picking up a void beneath the tiles, a space where there should have been solid earth. Martinez's jaw tightened. "We've got something." Nathan's smile faltered just a fraction. "I told you, my wife." "Save it," Sandra snapped, standing and turning to him, her voice cutting through the sterile air. "We're done listening to your explanations. You're not in control here anymore." She signaled to the team, and they began removing the tiles, one by one, the soft scrape of metal on ceramic sending a shiver down her spine. The room fell into an uneasy silence, the only sound, the steady breathing of the officers and the rhythmic clink of tile meeting tile. As the last row was lifted, the truth lay bare, a makeshift grave beneath the kitchen floor, the packed earth still damp, the outline of a body wrapped in an old bedsheet. Aisha's final resting place, hidden in the heart of her own home. For a moment, no one moved. Even Martinez's usually steady voice caught in his throat. Sandra stared down at the sheet, her heart aching for the woman who had once laughed in this very room, who had taught her son how to read and write, who had been more than the sum of this cold, silent grave. "Elijah was right," she said softly, more to herself than to anyone else. "He told us the truth, and we're going to make sure the world knows it." Nathan shifted uneasily, the mask slipping from his face for the first time. "You can't prove anything," he said, but his voice was thin now, cracking at the edges. She was unstable. She wanted to leave. Sandra turned to him slowly, her eyes like flint. "Unstable? Or just inconvenient for you and your plans?" Martinez stepped forward, holding up his phone. "The contractor confessed to taking cash from you, Nathan. No questions asked. You paid him to bury your wife under her own kitchen." Nathan's face blanched, the blood draining away to leave only the ghost of his arrogance. "This isn't over," he said in a low, desperate voice. Sandra took a step closer, her voice calm and certain. "Oh, but it is. For you. For her, it's finally just beginning. The truth, the justice she deserved." As the forensics team carefully lifted the body from the ground, wrapping it with the reverence of those who knew they were holding not just remains, but a story that had been silenced too long, Sandra turned away, her jaw tight, her heart pounding. She thought of Elijah, of the quiet courage it had taken for him to speak up when no one else would. She thought of Aisha's last words to her son, "Be brave, Eli," and how that single plea had become a beacon in the darkness. Martinez exhaled shakily. "We need to call the coroner and the DA." Sandra nodded. "Do it, and get someone to stay with Elijah. He's going to need someone he trusts today more than ever." Outside, the sun was finally breaking through the mist, pale light slanting in through the kitchen windows, touching the cold tiles with a fragile warmth. Sandra stood in that light for a moment, feeling it on her face, letting it anchor her to the promise she had made. They had found her. They had pulled the truth from beneath the floor, piece by piece, until it lay open and undeniable. And though the weight of it pressed down on her like the grave itself, she knew she would carry it, because a little boy had whispered the truth, and the world had finally listened. The coroner's van arrived with a quiet finality that settled over the neighborhood like a winter frost. Sandra watched from the doorway as the white bags and the careful silent work of the forensic team carried out Aisha's final journey from the house she had once made a home. The neighbors watched too, curtains drawn back just a crack, eyes wide and unblinking, whispers already spreading through the thin morning air. In the midst of the quiet chaos, Nathan Taylor sat slumped in a chair in the living room, his face a mask of studied indifference that cracked around the edges with every passing moment. Martinez moved in and out of the kitchen, his notepad growing thick with notes and names, but his expression stayed the same, grim, resolute, a man who had stopped asking if this was real and had begun gathering the answers he needed to make it undeniable. Sandra stood in the kitchen doorway, the scent of earth and damp tiles still sharp in her nostrils. She watched the light play across the floor, stripped now of the shiny new tiles, raw and honest, the wound of the grave open and bleeding in the heart of the house. It was strange how a home could seem to absorb everything around it, the laughter of children, the whispered secrets of lovers, the silent, desperate bargains of the broken. And in that kitchen, the weight of all of it pressed down on her shoulders like the very earth that had hidden Aisha's body for days. She turned to Martinez, her voice low. "How's Elijah?" Martinez sighed, glancing at his phone. Mrs. Rosa took him to her place. "He's quiet, but she says he's eating a little. That's something." Sandra nodded, her jaw tight. "He's a brave kid. He deserves to grow up in a world that listens to him." Martinez looked at her, something flickering in his eyes. "You think he really understands what he saw?" "He understands more than most adults would," she said, her voice firm. "He saw it all, Martinez, and he's the one who made us see it too." Nathan shifted in his chair, his eyes darting up to them with a flicker of defiance. "You think you've got it all figured out?" he said, his voice hoarse. "You don't know the first thing about my family." Sandra walked over, her boots scuffing the bare floor. "No, Nathan, but I know enough. I know you had a wife who loved her son more than anything. I know you buried her under the floor you promised would be a fresh start. And I know your son saw everything you thought he'd be too scared to tell." Nathan's jaw clenched, his shoulders tensing, as if he could still find some last reserve of arrogance to lean on, but it was gone, washed away by the truth Elijah had spoken with the quiet certainty of a child who doesn't yet know how to lie. Sandra knelt in front of him, her face level with his. "You tried to bury her twice, once under the floor and again under your lies. But a child's voice doesn't get silenced that easily, Nathan, and neither do I." He looked away then, his shoulders sagging. The final blow wasn't the tiles or the warrant or the weight of the law. It was the realization that the smallest witness had become the most powerful. Outside, the coroner's van drove away and the weight in the house shifted. The forensics team moved like ghosts, cataloging, photographing, gathering each piece of evidence that would speak for Aisha when she no longer could. Martinez came to stand beside Sandra, his notebook closed, his voice quiet. "We have enough to charge him. The DA's ready to move." Sandra nodded, her eyes still fixed on Nathan. "Then let's do it. He doesn't get to hide behind privilege anymore." As they read him his rights, Nathan didn't struggle. He didn't shout or protest. He just sat there, the mask finally slipping away to reveal the hollow man underneath. The man who had tried to steal a future he didn't deserve. The click of the handcuffs was loud in the quiet house, echoing through the empty rooms like the final note of a song. Sandra watched as they led him away, her breath steady, her heart heavy but certain. Justice was never an easy thing, but in that moment it felt closer than it had in days. After Nathan was gone, Sandra took a moment to stand in the kitchen alone. She let her hand rest on the bare earth where Aisha had been hidden, her fingers pressing into the cold dirt. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm sorry it took us this long." She didn't know if the dead could hear, but she hoped Aisha could feel that promise in the quiet of the morning. She hoped Elijah would grow up knowing that his mother's story had been heard, that her truth had broken through the lies. Martinez returned, his footsteps soft on the bare floor. "Sandra, you should see this," he said, holding up a small evidence bag. Inside was a ring, Aisha's wedding ring, the silver band worn smooth by years of love and struggle. "We found it in the basement, hidden behind the water heater, like he didn't even care enough to keep it close." Sandra took the bag, her fingers brushing the cold plastic. She thought of Aisha's laughter, the warmth of her voice in Elijah's memories. "She deserves better than this," she said quietly. Martinez nodded. "She'll get it, and so will he." Outside, the sun was climbing higher, the clouds breaking apart to let the light flood the street. Neighbors gathered in small worried groups, their faces pale and shocked, the rumors already growing like weeds in the cracks of the sidewalk. Sandra stepped out onto the porch, the light warm on her face, the weight of the case settling into her bones like the slow ache of an old wound. She looked down the street to where Mrs. Rosa's house stood. A safe place. A promise of healing for a boy who had seen too much. She knew it wouldn't be easy. The trial would be long, the questions endless. But she also knew that the truth was no longer buried. It had been spoken by a child who refused to be silent, by the courage of a boy who had seen his world crack open and found the strength to tell the story anyway. And in that courage, in that quiet, stubborn refusal to forget, she saw the first fragile glimmer of hope. Aisha's story wasn't over. It was just beginning. And Sandra would carry it forward, no matter how heavy it became. Sandra stood in the quiet kitchen, the hollow sound of the last tile being pried away, still echoing in her mind. The house, stripped of its secrets, had become something else entirely. No longer a home, but a crime scene, the final act of a story that had begun with whispers in the night. She took a breath, the stale air thick with the ghosts of everything that had been hidden. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, a low hum that seemed almost out of place in the stillness. She glanced at the screen, an incoming call from Dr. Patricia Moore, the child psychologist she had trusted with the fragile truth of Elijah's story. "Dr. Moore," she said, stepping into the hallway to speak more privately. "Tell me you have good news." The calm, measured voice of the doctor came through the line. "Sandra, I spent the morning with Elijah. He's remarkably clear for a child his age. More than that, he's consistent. He doesn't flinch or change his story. It's like he's carrying the weight of it with him, and he's too young to even understand how heavy it really is." Sandra closed her eyes, the ache in her chest growing. "And you think he can testify if it comes to that?" There was a pause, and then Dr. Moore's voice softened. "He can, but we have to be careful. He's a child, Sandra. He understands what he saw, but he doesn't understand what it means, not in the way an adult would. He knows his mother is gone, and he knows who took her. But the rest of it, the betrayal, the coldness of it all, he's still trying to make sense of that." Sandra nodded, even though she knew Dr. Moore couldn't see it. "I understand. Thank you for everything you're doing for him. He's the bravest little boy I've ever met," Dr. Moore said quietly, "and he's telling the truth. Don't let anyone make you doubt that." "I won't," Sandra said, her voice firm. "I won't let them bury him the way they tried to bury her." She ended the call and leaned against the wall, feeling the weight of the promise she'd just made settle into her bones. Outside, the forensic team was loading the last of the evidence into the vans, their careful, methodical movements a stark contrast to the chaos that had led them here. Martinez approached, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion. "The DA wants to move quickly," he said. "He's seen the statements, the evidence from the renovation crew, the financial records. He thinks we have enough to take it to trial within weeks." Sandra nodded. "Good. We can't let them twist this into something it's not. Elijah's voice needs to be heard." Martinez hesitated, then lowered his voice. "Sandra, you know how these things go. They're going to try to paint him as confused. A child's imagination, they'll say. Nathan's lawyers are already circling like sharks." "Let them," she said, her voice cold. "I've seen enough to know that boy isn't making up stories, and I'll fight for him, no matter how dirty it gets." Martinez looked at her for a moment, then gave a short nod. "All right. Then we make sure we're ready. No mistakes." The weight of it settled over them both. But in that shared silence there was also resolve, a quiet agreement that no matter how hard this fight would be, they would see it through to the end. That afternoon, Sandra drove to Mrs. Rosa's house to check on Elijah herself. The small, cozy home was a world away from the cold, sterile crime scene she had just left, the air warm and filled with the smell of fresh bread and old wood. Mrs. Rosa met her at the door, her eyes tired but kind. "He's in the back room, playing with his trucks," she said softly. "He doesn't say much, but he's calmer. I think he feels safe here." Sandra stepped inside, her eyes adjusting to the soft lamplight. In the back room, she found Elijah on the floor, the worn carpet a sea of little toy cars and trucks. He looked up when he saw her, his small face breaking into a tentative smile. "Hi, Lieutenant," he said shyly. "Hi, Elijah," she replied, kneeling down to be level with him. "How are you feeling today?" He thought for a moment, then shrugged. "Okay. Grandma Rosa made me pancakes." Sandra smiled faintly. "That's good. Pancakes make everything a little better." He pushed a small red car toward her, the wheels squeaking on the carpet. "Are you going to find the bad man?" he asked, his voice soft but certain. She met his eyes, seeing the hope there, the quiet belief that somehow the world would make sense again if she just said yes. I am, Elijah, she said firmly. We've already found out so much because of you. You helped us see what no one else could. His small hands stilled on the car, and he looked at her with an intensity that took her breath away. I didn't want to tell, he whispered, but Mommy said I had to be brave. So I was. Sandra swallowed hard, her throat tight. You were more than brave, Elijah. You were the strongest person in that whole house. He nodded solemnly, as if accepting an unspoken truth. Sandra reached out and gently ruffled his hair. I want you to keep being brave, okay? We're going to make sure everyone knows the truth. Your mommy's story matters, and so does yours. For a moment, the weight of everything else fell away, and it was just her and this small, courageous boy in a room full of toy trucks and whispered promises. In that quiet, she made another silent vow. She would carry his truth as far as it needed to go, no matter who tried to bury it. She rose to her feet, her heart heavy but resolute. Outside, the sun was starting to sink behind the trees, the sky a wash of pink and gold. As she stepped out into the evening air, she felt the first real glimmer of something she hadn't felt in days. Hope. The truth was out now. It had a name, a face, and the unbreakable courage of a child who refused to let it die in the dark. And Sandra knew that no matter how long the road ahead might be, she would walk every step of it for him, for Elijah, for Aisha, for the truth that refused to stay buried. The courtroom was scheduled to reconvene in just 1 week, and the weight in the air felt heavier than any storm. Lieutenant Sandra Brown stood in her office late one evening, the golden desk lamp throwing a pool of light across her files. Voluminous, meticulously organized, yet still growing. She ran her fingers over Elijah's name, written in neat script atop a stack of photographs. Grainy stills of the kitchen tiles being removed, the imprints of feet on the dirt, the heavy bags discovered in the basement. She ran her hand over a faded photo of Elijah standing beside Mrs. Rosa in the kitchen doorway, his dark eyes somber, his small hand wrapped tightly in hers. That photo had become her talisman, proof that truth often wears a child's face. As she reviewed notes from the DA's office, there came a soft knock on the door. Martinez stepped in, exhaustion evident in the shadow beneath his eyes. He shut the door behind him, the click loud in the silence. They want to schedule a mini-hearing first, he said, lowering his voice. Defense is requesting to dismiss Elijah's testimony, claiming he's too young, unreliable. Sandra felt a firm knot of anger tighten in her chest. Of course. They would try to discredit the one witness who had seen it all, heard it all, and yet hadn't lied once. They would paint his courage as fantasy. They'll need more than that, she said evenly. We've got corroboration. Contractor, cell tower records, financial transfers, the body, the ring, and we've got Dr. Moore validating his psychology. There's no foundation for that motion. Martinez exhaled slowly. I know, but they'll muddy the waters. Nathan's got the resources to drag this out. Sandra nodded. Then we make sure we don't let them muddy anything. I want every detail ready. I want mock cross-exams set. Dr. Moore prepped. Elijah knows he's safe here. Martinez half smiled. You're fighting for him as much as for her. She looked at him, eyes softening. He carried that burden alone long enough. He doesn't have to carry it through his trial. The next morning, the courtroom pulsed with tension. Journalists lined the benches, cameras poised. Lawyers moved briskly in tailored suits. A hush fell as Judge Morrison entered and took his seat, gavel still new. Sandra watched from across the aisle, Elijah at her side. He wore a navy blue sweater, his curly hair neatly combed. He pressed a small red toy truck into her hand under the bench, hers to hold as a reminder. The defense attorney rose first, rising with practiced calm. He began to speak of child psychology, neurological development, the unreliability of memory before age 7. He cited studies, experts, legal precedent. Your Honor, we firmly assert that Elijah Taylor cannot be a reliable witness. His youth makes him vulnerable to suggestion, to emotional transfer, to fantasy. Sandra felt her heart throb, but she held the truck like armor. Dr. Patricia Moore took the stand next. The room leaned forward. She spoke softly, measured, unwavering. He is remarkably consistent across multiple interviews. He doesn't embellish. His memory of the event remains unchanged. His emotional responses are appropriate to what he witnessed. He is, for his age, a reliable and truthful source. A murmur ran through the courtroom. The defense objected. The DA's table flourished exhibits, transcripts of interviews, Elijah's drawings, the call logs, the receipts, the bank transfers. A paused breath, and the judge turned to the defense. Finally he spoke, voice low. "I will allow the testimony, but I expect all legal protections to be in place." There was quiet relief in Sandra's chest. Elijah didn't need to be crucified to receive justice. He'd earned his chance to speak. After the hearing, Sandra knelt beside him at the courthouse steps. "You did amazing, Elijah. You helped them learn the truth." He looked at her with solemn eyes, just 6 years old, yet as old as sorrow itself. "I just told the truth," he said. And she realized children don't spin webs of lies. They break chains of injustice. She stood to greet Mrs. Rosa, who had watched warily from the back row. The older woman's eyes glistened with pride. "He was so brave," she whispered. That afternoon, Sandra made a real push to local media, carefully, compassionately, highlighting Elijah's bravery and Aisha's story. She wanted the community to see him as a witness to their truth, not a problematic child. Meanwhile, at the precinct, Martinez was hunting down more evidence. He found text messages between Nathan and John Mallory. Bribes, exchanges, panic, raw. He also discovered alarming calls from Nathan to the contractor during the renovation. Voice messages, keeper of his guilt. By late evening, Sandra reviewed everything and met with D.A. D'Angelo in his office, across the street. He was a tall man, imposing even seated, his desk piled with legal briefs. "We have to move fast," he said. "The defense is preparing mental health arguments, child reliability motions. They want to bring in emotional experts. We need counter-witnesses." Sandra blinked. She hadn't expected this level of defense depth. "We can call Dr. Moore for cross-examination support. We can track sewage records, timeline matches, cleanup activity. And what about Elijah's drawings? We could present them as illustrative, but not the centerpiece." D.A. nodded. "Right, drawings support his verse, not drive it. We anchor on physical forensics." He looked serious. "Sandra, you've captured the true story. You've done as well as any detective ever could. Now it's up to me to beat back their spin machines." Back at home that night, Sandra curled up on the couch, reviewing her notes by lamp. She realized she hadn't processed the anguish she witnessed against Nathan's arrogance. In her mind, she played the moments. His icy deflection at dawn, his desperate glare today, Elijah's unwavering stare. A torrent of emotion rose within her. Not rage, precisely, but a kind of resolute sorrow. This wasn't just a case. It was a reckoning. She saved her summary on the DA's shared drive, closed her laptop, and started to stand, but then paused. Her daylight brain had stored more than evidence. It held guilt and grief. She sank back with a sigh and slipped into soft music on the radio, notes drifting over her exhaustion. In the next hour, she slept sitting up, dreams full of cold tiles, distant sobs, and the weight of silence. The sunrise tomorrow would bring more preparation. Mock cross exams, media narrative, court logistics, legal strategy, forensics backups, emotional support for Elijah, safety planning. Every sting of injustice demanded meticulous response. She was fully awake to that duty, ready for the trial that might change the way this city saw child testimony, ready to honor the bravery of a little boy, ready to stand unafraid beneath the gavel's shadow and meet anybody with the unspoken truth she carried in her heart. The trial began in earnest as the courtroom fills with hushed anticipation, the hum of camera flashes barely contained behind the back wall. Lieutenant Sandra Brown takes her seat beside the district attorney, pencil ready, heart steady. Across from her, the defense team files in, their expressions primed with cold calculation. At the center of it all is Elijah, seated between Dr. Moore and Mrs. Rosa, his small figure swallowed by the oversized chair, clutching his red toy truck like a beacon of truth. The first witness is the contractor from Jarvis Construction. He recounts the night he laid the new kitchen tiles in the Taylor home, cash payment from Nathan, the hush in the kitchen as the tiles were pulled up, an odd tightness in the air, the river of words Billy tried not to hear down below. His voice trembles when he mentions the heavy bags tossed into the basement, the banging and scraping inside the walls. On the stand, Sandra notices how quickly his face pales at each mention of Nathan's name. The ice of guilt trembles visibly. Next, Dr. Moore returns to offer expert testimony on child memory and witness credibility. She speaks of Elijah's consistency, his absence of coaching or suggestion, how each recounting of the story, the cries, the dragging, the panic, held the same cadence and emotional weight. Her professional voice reverberates around the courtroom, hushing every murmur. The defense seeks to discredit her, questioning her methods, invoking vague fear about childhood vulnerability. Yet Dr. Moore stands firm, logical, unwavering, human. And then, the moment everyone has been waiting for arrives. The judge calls for Elijah. The audience holds its breath as the little boy approaches the stand. He climbs up, his boots eerily silent on the wooden stairs, blue eyes meeting the jury with a clarity no one expected. His voice shakes only once, a soft quiver, but then steadies as he describes the kitchen floor, the sounds of his mother sobbing, the clang of tiles removed, the slippery drag of her body, the outline of the grave beneath the surface. He does not cry. He does not waver. At times, his color fades, emotion pushing near the surface, but he maintains his composure, guided gently by Dr. Moore when needed, and comforted by Mrs. Rosa. The courtroom is silent when he finishes. The only sound, the dull tick of the clock mounted high on the wall. The judge pauses, acknowledges the courage it took for a 6-year-old to stand there and speak about such horror. The jury exchanges glances, no notes, no distractions, only rapt attention. Over the next hours, Sandra presents the financial evidence. Nathan's bank transfers, shell company filings for John Mallory, unexplained cash transactions after Aisha's disappearance. She shows the jury photos from the crime scene, the empty space beneath the tiles, the body's outline, the recovered wedding ring, each image pushing the narrative home. Nathan testifies in his own defense, his voice polished, practiced. He claims he loved Aisha, that she was depressed and left without warning, that the contractor lied, that Elijah fabricated everything to cope with loss. But Sandra stands ready. On cross-examination, she notes inconsistencies in his story. His timeline doesn't match the cell tower data. His alibi doesn't account for the hours the tiles were being replaced. His expression cracks when she notes the ring was wiped clean before being hidden. His confident mask slips, and Sandra sees the man behind the myth. Then, just as the defense attempts a final push to cast doubt, bringing in a child psychologist, testifying about the fragility of young memory, Dr. Moore rises again. She describes Elijah's drawings, his spontaneous recounting under controlled conditions, his emotional congruence, the type of memory recall only possible when a child witnesses trauma. The defense stumbles under her authority. By evening, the testimony wraps up, and closing arguments begin. The district attorney reminds the jury of the tears frozen in Elijah's eyes, the contractor's trembling admission, the physical evidence, the cold disregard Nathan showed as he buried his wife. The defense counters fiercely, spinning conjecture, playback of Nixon-esque lingering doubt, attempt after attempt to shift blame onto grief, on false memory, on loss too great to bear. But Sandra hears the jurors lean forward in their seats, just once too often. She hears their minds awakening to the painful clarity laid bare by a child's simple, devastating words. As the judge gives final instructions, Sandra looks at Elijah, his expression calm but exhausted. She gives him a small nod, a sign of gratitude and pride. In her heart, she knows this doesn't erase what he's endured, but it reaffirms his courage wasn't born of fantasy. It was forged in horrific reality, and now, through him, justice will move forward. The jury files out to deliberate, and in the hush that follows, Sandra exhales, letting reality sink in. They told the truth, every piece meticulously woven together, from the hush of the kitchen to the beat of a child's heart. Now, they wait, and hope that the world chooses courage over complicity. The hours ticked by like decades in that quiet courthouse corridor. Outside, the sun dipped lower and lower, the light turning from bright gold to dusky rose, casting long shadows across the polished floors. Inside, it felt as though time had stopped altogether. Sandra sat on a worn bench just outside the courtroom, her eyes fixed on the double doors that guarded the fate of Elijah's truth. Martinez paced nearby, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, his shoulders stiff with restless energy. Mrs. Rosa sat with Elijah, reading softly from a children's book she had pulled from her worn purse. Her voice was gentle, her fingers brushing the boy's hair when his eyes began to droop. Elijah, for all his earlier courage, was fighting sleep, the weight of the day finally settling over him like a blanket of exhaustion. Sandra watched them and felt a fierce protectiveness swell in her chest. Whatever the jury decided, she knew this little boy had already done more than anyone could have asked of him. He had spoken the truth, and in that truth, he had found a kind of freedom. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting herself breathe, letting herself feel the ache and the hope mingling in her chest. When the courtroom doors finally swung open, a hush fell across the hallway. The jury filed out, their faces solemn, their eyes avoiding those of the people who waited to hear their decision. Sandra rose to her feet, her heart thudding hard against her ribs. Martinez stopped pacing and moved to stand beside her, their shoulders brushing in silent solidarity. Elijah stirred, his dark eyes blinking open, and Mrs. Rosa gathered him up in her arms, holding him close as they all moved slowly into the courtroom. The judge was already seated, his gavel resting silently on the polished wood. The courtroom was packed now, the air electric with tension, every breath held in the space between moments. Nathan sat at the defense table, his expression carefully neutral, but Sandra could see the flicker of nerves in the way he tapped one finger against the edge of the table. He looked smaller than he had in the beginning, the weight of his own arrogance finally pressing down on him. The jury foreman stood, the verdict slip held in one hand. The judge's voice was calm, but carried the weight of finality. "Have you reached a verdict?" "We have, Your Honor." "Please read the verdict." The foreman cleared his throat, his voice steady in the charged silence. "On the charge of murder in the first degree, we find the defendant, Nathan Taylor, guilty." The word echoed in the courtroom like a bell, like a final nail in the coffin of Nathan's lies. There was a collective gasp, a shiver of sound that moved through the room. Sandra felt her knees weaken with relief, her hand closing tightly around the small red toy truck Elijah had given her earlier. She didn't dare look away from the foreman as he continued. "On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder, we find the defendant guilty." Nathan's shoulders slumped, the mask finally shattering, his face pale and drawn. His lawyer reached out, but he pulled away, his eyes staring at nothing. For a moment, there was only silence. Then the judge spoke, his voice low and even. "This court thanks the jury for their service. Sentencing will be scheduled within the week." He banged the gavel once, the sound ringing out like thunder. The room erupted into a low hum of whispers, the weight of the moment settling over everyone. Sandra turned to Elijah, who was watching her with wide, tired eyes. She knelt down, her voice soft but firm. "You did it, Elijah. You told the truth, and the world heard you." He didn't smile, but he leaned into Mrs. Rosa's side, his small hand reaching out to touch Sandra's shoulder. "Mommy can sleep now," he said, his voice no louder than a whisper. Sandra swallowed hard, her throat tight with unshed tears. "Yes, baby," she said. "She can rest, and so can you." Martinez moved to stand behind her, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder, a silent acknowledgement of the battle they had fought together. Across the aisle, Nathan was being led away in handcuffs, his head bowed. There was no fight left in him now, no defiance, only the cold, empty silence of a man who had finally been forced to face the truth. Outside the courthouse, the city was already buzzing with news of the verdict. Reporters crowded the steps, cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward like weapons. Sandra shielded Elijah and Mrs. Rosa as they stepped into the fading light, her own face set with quiet resolve. She answered a few questions, brief, measured statements about justice, about the power of a child's voice, about the community's resilience. But she didn't linger. This wasn't about the headlines or the sound bites. It was about a little boy who had refused to be silenced. That night, back at the precinct, Sandra sat at her desk long after everyone else had gone home. She looked at the photo of Aisha that now hung on the wall, a small memorial to the woman whose life had been stolen and whose story had finally been heard. She thought of Elijah asleep at Mrs. Rosa's house, safe at last, his future no longer overshadowed by the darkness that had almost consumed him. She thought of the long fight ahead, sentencing, appeals, the years it would take to fully heal the wounds that had been ripped open. But in that quiet, she also felt something else, the calm certainty that this was what justice looked like. It wasn't always perfect, and it didn't erase the pain, but it was a start. It was a promise kept. As the clock ticked past midnight, Sandra leaned back in her chair, her eyes closed. She let herself rest for just a moment, the echo of the gavel still ringing in her ears. The weight of the truth finally lifted from the shadows. She knew tomorrow would bring more work, more battles, more truths to uncover. But tonight, in this small space of victory, she allowed herself to believe that sometimes, just sometimes, the world could be set right by the voice of a child who refused to stop speaking. The first rays of sunlight pierced the heavy courtroom curtains, illuminating faces tense with anticipation. The sentencing hearing was underway, and the air was thick with the weight of what had been set in motion by a 6-year-old's courage. Lieutenant Sandra Brown sat in the front row, her posture straight, the red toy truck, now wrapped in a clear evidence bag, resting on her lap. Mrs. Rosa sat beside her, Elijah leaning into her shoulder, silent but present, as if the final act of this painful journey would bring him closer to peace. The judge, solemn and unwavering, recited the facts: premeditated murder, conspiracy, concealment of the body, all laid bare by a child's revelation and reinforced by layers of evidence: tile fragments, cell tower logs, shell company ledgers, contractor testimony, phone records, and the emotional honesty of Dr. Moore's evaluations. When Nathan Taylor was sentenced to life without parole, the gavel echoed like a verdict, not only against him, but against every lie that had tried to suffocate Aisha's truth. Martinez exhaled audibly, the tension draining from his eyes. Sandra's heart clenched, relief, sorrow, exhaustion, hope, all tangled in one seismic moment. On the courthouse steps afterward, the press swarmed again, but Sandra felt a surge of quiet defiance. This moment belonged not to headlines, but to healing. She carried Elijah into the bright morning light and rested a gentle hand on his small shoulder. "You did it, buddy," she whispered, her voice hushed but firm. "That was for your mommy." A simple statement for monumental bravery. At Mrs. Rosa's cozy living room later, Elijah rested on a quilt, the scent of freshly baked cookies drifting through the open window. Sandra sat nearby, hands wrapped around a warm cup of tea. The weight of the last weeks pressed gentle fatigue into her bones, but her spirit felt lighter than it had in a long time. She watched the soft rise and fall of Elijah's chest as he slept, no longer haunted by bad dreams. Mrs. Rosa sat down beside her, offering a soft hum of empathy. "He's strong," she said quietly. "He deserves someone who would believe him." Sandra nodded, emotion flickering in her eyes. And he got one. So did his mother. A week later, community volunteers gathered at the Taylor home. The house still stood, empty and quiet, but the foundation was being reborn. An artist painted a mural on the porch, a vibrant portrait of Aisha smiling under a canopy of trees. A brick that once covered her grave was repurposed into a plaque, in memory of Aisha Taylor, beloved teacher and mother, whose story reminded us that the smallest voices can hold the greatest truths. Sandra was there, camera hanging around her neck, more as a witness than a collector, capturing the tears of neighbors. The hugs of strangers who knew Elijah's story stirred something deep in their hearts. By late afternoon, crowds drifted to the backyard where the house had been transformed into a community resource room, a safe place for families to get support, to talk, to gather. Mrs. Rosa led Elijah to a bench beneath a newly planted magnolia tree. The bench bore Aisha's name. The boy traced the letters with his small fingertip, his face solemn but peaceful. That evening, Sandra returned to her desk. The photo of Aisha smiled down her hallway, now surrounded by mementos from the community. Children's drawings, thank you notes, small stones painted with bravery, hashtags. She pulled out a clean case folder. It was time to close the file on Aisha Taylor, not with an official stamp, but with a quiet truth, that her death had sparked something stronger than grief. Dr. Moore's report landed in her inbox, summarizing how the Kesha protocol, now referred to as the Child Witness Guidelines, would be adopted statewide to ensure children like Elijah were heard, protected, and dignified. Sandra paused, her fingertips brushing the screen. A child's testimony had changed the law. That weekend, she attended Elijah's first day back at school, Mrs. Green's classroom. She watched him sit at a desk, red truck tucked into his backpack, shy but steady. When Mrs. Green greeted him with encouragement and introduced him to classmates, Elijah nodded, voice quiet but clear. "I just want to learn." And learn he would, of letters, numbers, kindness, trust. By evening, Sandra hosted a small gathering in her living room. Mrs. Rosa, Dr. Moore, Martinez, the DA, a few community volunteers, all there to honor Aisha's memory and Elijah's journey. They spoke of justice, compassion, healing. Sandra stood and raised a glass of sparkling cider. "To Aisha," she said, voice steady, "and to Elijah, whose bravery taught us that hope does not come from power or privilege, but from an innocent voice that dared to speak." Martinez tapped his glass gently, to truth. Glasses clinked, tears and smiles intertwined. Sandra looked around the room, heart swelling. She thought of Aisha, buried under her own floor, voiceless for too long, and of Elijah, sparking a reckoning with his gentle confession. The next morning, Crime Lab techs assisted Dr. Moore in creating standardized training modules based on Elijah's case. Sandra was invited to speak to future officers about child-sensitive interviewing. Her note to the academy read, "Never overlook a child's whisper. Sometimes that whisper holds the power to rewrite a life." As weeks turned into months, the house continued to breathe new life. The community library inside hosted book clubs, parenting workshops, Speak Up Saturdays, protecting vulnerable voices. Elijah helped his teacher choose storybooks about courage and kindness, his hands small but firm. At the one-year anniversary of Aisha's death, Sandra attended a ceremony by the magnolia tree. Elijah laid yellow blossoms, his mother's favorite, on the bench. He looked up, meeting Sandra's eyes. "Mommy would like this, right?" Sandra knelt and met him at eye level. "She'd be so proud. You made sure her story wasn't forgotten." He smiled, the ancient wisdom of children in his eyes. "I just told the truth." This chapter of healing shows how from the darkest truths spring the seeds of transformation. A whisper can become a verdict. A child's courage can change laws, and a community can rebuild from the rubble of tragedy into something beautiful. Because when one small voice dares to speak, nobody can silence the truth. Elijah's quiet courage reminds us that sometimes the strongest warriors are the smallest among us, and that the power of a child's truth can outshine even the deepest darkness. In the echoes of his soft voice and the finality of the judge's gavel, we see that justice is not always swift, but it is always worth fighting for. If this story moved you, if it gave you hope that even in the most hopeless places there is light, let us know in the comments below. Have you ever witnessed a moment where an innocent voice cut through the noise to reveal the truth? Share your story, because every word of truth builds a world that listens. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss another story of resilience, bravery, and the unstoppable pursuit of justice. Because in this world, every truth matters, and together we make sure it's never buried again.